And now I'd like to introduce Chris Lovette, a professor of history at Emporia State University, which I'm proud to say is my alma mater. Chris is not only a historian of military history and U.S. national security policy, he's published extensively on the Cold War, but Chris is also one of your fellow Vietnam veterans. And without further comments from me, I'll introduce Chris, or welcome Chris. Thank you.
I consider it an honor to be here this morning speaking at the Eisenhower Presidential Library for the Remembering Vietnam Symposium. I owe much of this opportunity to two of my former history professors at Kansas State University, the late Robin Hyam and Burton I. Kaufman, who gave me the opportunity to teach Vietnam at K-State to a generation who was virtually tabula rasa about the conflict. Initially, the idea came to me when I was returning exams in a history class. Suddenly, I noticed a young co-ed wearing a baseball cap, which read, Mekong Delta 1968. I asked her if she had a father or uncle who served in Vietnam. Her response shocked me. No, she said. Instead, she went to a fraternity party with partygoers dressed as GIs, POWs, and Viet Cong. I was both shocked and angry, wondering what they were teaching in high school or in the U.S. history survey sections about the Vietnam War. I marched into Dr. Kaufman's office, told him what I thought and what I was prepared to do to give it, if I was given the opportunity to teach a college-level course on the war. Robin Hyam recommended that I go to West Point for one of their U.S. military history seminars, and I discovered while there that the senior officers, all West Point graduates, all instructors at the U.S. Military Academy, didn't want to talk about Vietnam either. But like many veterans, once I left the U.S. Army, I thought I put the Vietnam War behind me. I joined no veterans groups like my father and uncle. I never thought I would become involved in teaching about the conflict that so deeply divided our country. It was the last thing that ever entered my mind. Although I would never admit it at the time, I was somehow fascinated by the war, but how the United States became involved. I purchased books about Vietnam, searched used bookstores for early sources that reflected the divisive nature of the conflict. It was not like I didn't know about the war while I was growing up. I remember my mother getting me ready for school in the late 1950s and early 1960s and listening to the radio and hearing commentators talking about the Pathet Lao moving into the Plain of Jars and one Laotian village falling like another into the hands of the Pathet Lao as if they were the Germans threatening Paris in 1940. Even more problematic, I recall watching CBS News, watching Trick Quang Duc set himself on fire in a busy Saigon intersection in June of 1963, even though I didn't know his name at the time until I was much older on our black and white TV. Being a kid at the time and with no comprehension of historical trends, I thought the war would be over before I was ever sent. And it wasn't. And if it wasn't, off I would go like my father and uncle before me. Patriotism runs deep in working class families. My parents were blue collar. My mother worked for Bendix, a defense contractor in Eatontown, New Jersey. My father worked for General Motors in Hillside. They were lifelong Democrats. One of my father's cherished moments was seeing JFK in Elizabeth, New Jersey in 1960, when even driving around town with a JFK poster taped to the side of his Chevy Bel Air. When Ngo Dinh Diem and his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu were assassinated on November 2nd, 1963, like most Americans, I never realized the significance of that event. My teachers never discussed it in class. My classmates were not influenced either, since they had so many other things to do, like going to football games and hops, to worry about events that happened thousands of miles from home. Then shortly thereafter, on November 22nd, 1963, as my fellow teammates were preparing to take on Bruce Springsteen's alma mater, Freehold High School, in the final junior varsity football game in 1963, we received word of President Kennedy's assassination. Before Lyndon Johnson's landslide victory in 1964, I recall driving back from football practice and listening to reports of an alleged attack by North Vietnamese PT boats in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin. Most of my teammates had no idea what the Gulf of Tonkin was, never mind how Lyndon Johnson would use that event to expand the war that most of us never fully comprehended. Somehow, I wanted to know more. I read Time magazine, Newsweek, and U.S. News and World Report, and believed everything I read. Like so many at the time, I thought they were doing the right thing in defending a struggling and weak nation against foreign aggression. Not just foreign aggression, but communist aggression. In my junior year in high school, after the Marines landed in Da Nang in March 8, 1965, representatives from the U.S. Army came and spoke about Vietnam at my high school, even showing us captured Viet Cong flags, and how our advisors were training and building a new nation in Southeast Asia. Upon reflection, how naive were we? Before the end of my junior year in high school, one of my former teammates, who left school to join the Marines, returned to speak to us after he was wounded. At that time, the war finally came home. He was neither the first nor the last of my classmates to either be killed or wounded in service to their country. But events were moving quickly in Vietnam, not only for adolescent high school students, but for adults as well. Most Americans were unaware, but following the Kennedy's assassination in 1963, Johnson signed National Security Action Memorandum 273, which indicated President Johnson would continue President Kennedy's Vietnam policy. Where was Kennedy taking our country before his death? Unknown to most Americans, Kennedy's escalation was leading directly to a deeper commitment. Truman left Eisenhower 300 advisors in country, and Ike left Kennedy 900 advisors. By November 1963, that number had climbed to over 16,000 and continued to grow. William Rust, an editor of U.S. News and World Report, and author of Kennedy in Vietnam, doubted Kennedy would have done anything much different than LBJ. The American public didn't know of the secret DeSoto electronic intelligence gathering missions and Op Plan 34 Alpha raids along the North Vietnamese coast by the U.S. Navy and the South Vietnamese, especially before the critical Gulf of Tonkin incident and the subsequent Gulf of Tonkin resolution that was tantamount to a declaration of war. Although I ritually followed Walter Cronkite and CBS News like millions of other Americans, I never fathomed that the Rubicon they were about to cross when it came to Vietnam because of the Gulf of Tonkin incident. In viewing the events between 1964 and 1965, we must consider the options available to Lyndon Johnson. While the public was never privy to the backstory, Johnson had two options: bombing, which he ordered in retaliation for the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and negotiations. No one outside of Johnson's inner circle knew of the Air Force's Sigma 3 war game, which demonstrated that a sustained bombing campaign over North Vietnam couldn't force Hanoi either to the negotiating table or stop supporting the National Liberation Front. What other options did Johnson have in time when the domino theory was still alive and kicking? How was Johnson going to maintain the independence of the Republic of Vietnam as a viable state while it was teetering on collapse? Johnson never contemplated withdrawal. He and his advisors not only asked how could the Republic of Vietnam be saved, never whether Vietnam should be saved in the first place. If withdrawal was no longer an option, then what? The answer was simple: turn up the spigot and apply more force. McGeorge Bundy, President Johnson's national security advisor, who was also national security advisor to JFK, told Johnson that a time would come when a streetcar would arrive when he had the option to embark on a more ambitious program to apply force. The streetcar arrived on February 7, 1965, when the Viet Cong struck an advisor's barracks at Pleiku in the Central Highlands and a helicopter facility at Camp Holloway. I remember seeing that on CBS Evening News and was shocked. The casualties also shocked President Johnson, who authorized a sustained bombing campaign, a bombing campaign more to bolster the Republic of Vietnam than defeating the North. Dean Rusk, also, who was the Secretary of State at the time, told Johnson, if we go in, we have to be prepared for the long haul. When I went off to college at the College of Emporia in the summer of 1966, I thought the war would be over by the time I graduated. I never realized how the Kennedy administration and later the Johnson and Nixon administrations sought to control the news coming out of Vietnam, particularly following an obscure battle between the Viet Cong and the ARVN at Apbac on January 2, 1963. Then, despite superior weapons, including helicopters and armored personnel carriers, ARVN troops were defeated. Then Lieutenant Colonel John Paul Vann, the American advisor, in a fit of anger and rage, told American journalists the truth about the ARVN. Kennedy was so incensed, he wanted the reporter David Halberstam of the New York Times recalled, as well as Neil Sheehan of the United Press International. Like something out of 6 Degrees of Separation or Zelig, I met Vann when I was in Vietnam. I seriously doubt he noticed me, a mere Spec 4, when he was a civilian commanding a corps late in the conflict before his death. Overall, the message conveyed by the print and television media was that we were winning. Later, going into 1967, I was informed by my parents and close friends that more and more of my classmates were being drafted. On campus, the war was a hot topic. Debates about the war became intense and bitter, both inside and outside of class. Then in the summer of 1967, while I was home during summer break, I watched a program on CBS Reports entitled The Anderson Platoon, which gave a graphic image of a 33-man platoon from the 1st Cavalry under the command of Joseph Anderson, a black West Pointer who graduated from Topeka High in Topeka, Kansas. The situation was graphic and raised concerns whether we were actually winning the war. In November of 1967, General Westmoreland returned to Washington and appeared before the National Press Club. Earlier, we saw an increase in troop levels, but promised that he saw the end of the tunnel, something that not only LBJ wanted to hear, but many Americans too. Westmoreland's statement indicated that we had turned the corner and were winning. It was only just a matter of time. But then the North Vietnamese conducted a major offensive operation during the Tet holiday season in January 1968. Normally, Tet signaled a truce, allowing combatants, North and South Vietnamese and Viet Cong, to return to their homes for a short duration. But Hanoi instead embarked on a strategic offensive to win the war in one titanic battle. When I heard news that the Viet Cong had attacked the U.S. Embassy in Saigon and that it was captured, which later proved erroneous, not only did I, but millions of other Americans echoed Walter Cronkite's opinion, I thought we were winning the war. Later, when I was sent to Vietnam, I was assigned to that same unit that protected the U.S. Embassy, Company C, 716th MPs, which was wiped out when its alert force was ambushed on its way to relieve its beleaguered comrades. As more of my friends were being drafted, I made a fateful decision to enlist in the U.S. Marine Corps, in the U.S. Marine Corps Platoon Leadership Program, before the Tet Offensive. I was sent to Quantico, Virginia for 10 weeks of training in the summer of 1969. In the meantime, it seemed the country was coming apart at the seams. Anti-war demonstrations were occurring everywhere. Since I initially supported the war, former friends saw me as a warmonger and would no longer talk to me. Girls that I dated were no longer interested. This became more and more evident when I wrote a letter to the editor of the Emporia Gazette, William Lindsay White, challenging one of Bill Malden's political cartoons that appeared in the paper comparing My Lai to the Nazi murderers at Liedersee in 1942. When White agreed with me, I lost even more friends. I returned home for summer break in the summer of 1969 when I picked up our daily newspaper, the Red Bank Register. The front page was covered in red bunting with the words, "A Middletown Marine killed in Vietnam." I somehow knew, even before I read the article, that I knew who that Marine was. He was my close friend, Tom Levens. He was 21 when he was killed. On May 31st, 1969, like many of my teammates, I went to his funeral. His mother had an open casket funeral and was talking to her deceased son as each of us paid our respects. Nearly 50 years have passed, and I cannot forget that tragic event. Shortly therefore, I was off to Quantico, and it was perhaps Tom Levens' death that affected me more than I realized. I graduated from OCS, and the Marines promised that I would be commissioned upon graduation. But the Corps had other ideas and wanted me to travel to Kansas City to take the oath of office. Not long after I returned to campus. By then, I started to have doubts whether I could lead young Marines into combat. What would happen if I was like that platoon commander in Oliver Stone's platoon, or Lieutenant Dan in Forrest Gump, and called in a fire mission on my own men? After much thought, I refused my commission, and the Marines were none too happy with me, and I was reclassified immediately 1A into the U.S. Army. By then, I had a date with my draft board. Following my graduation in May of 1970, I received my induction to report for a pre-induction physical. By a clerical snafu, it's a little complicated. I didn't appear on the original manifest for those scheduled for induction, and I was sent back to my draft board. I told the clerk that I had been accepted to graduate school, and she told me that I was entitled to 2 appeals of my reclassification. By then, I was back at Emporia at KSDC, working on my MA, when I was finally notified to report for induction on or about December 20th, 1970. I notified my draft board where I was, and they gave me until June 1st, 1971 to report for induction. Following my induction, I was sent to Fort Dix for basic. During the midpoint of basic, a number of my fellow draftees were assembled in the mess hall by an officer who asked if we wanted to volunteer to become MPs. Someone, I forget who, asked if we agreed, would we be sent to Vietnam? The officer, with a complete straight face, said, "Of course not. We don't send MPs to Vietnam." So off we went to Fort Gordon. Then late in the training cycle, the first sergeant ordered the company to fall in and read off a list of names. Someone who was called, everyone who was called, was to report immediately for a drug test. Scuttlebutt had it that if your name was called, you would receive orders for Vietnam. Since I was the senior trainee, I approached the top and asked if that was true, and he told me it was. 200, 210 out of 225 men. Our orders gave us a 2-week leave before reporting to Fort Lewis. A group of us rented a van to drive to Atlanta to fly home. While we were processing our tickets at the counter, I noticed Captain Ernest Medina at a nearby counter, who was recently acquitted during his court-martial at Fort McPherson for his role in the My Lai massacre. Most of my fellow GIs didn't know who he was and what he did. Unlike troops being sent to the fighting fronts during World War II, going to Vietnam was different. Then troops traveled via troop transports, and it took a week or 2 to arrive in a combat zone. With jet travel, you were in Vietnam in hours. After the initial wave of combat units sent to Vietnam, replacements were sent via charter, landing in Da Nang, Cam Ranh Bay, or Tan Son Nhut. My flight landed in Da Nang in the fall of 1971. Landing in a war zone was a shock. Upon deployment, we were loaded into buses with wire mesh on the windows, with guards riding shotgun in gun jeeps leading forward and rear of the column. If that wasn't enough, when we arrived at the replacement depot, we were advised not to use the bunkers since the bunkers were condemned during a rocket attack. In case of incoming rockets, we were told to use our mattresses for protection. Welcome to Vietnam. While at the replacement depot, we received our alert gear and awaited orders for our unit assignments. On the third day after arrival, a few of us received orders to return to Da Nang for a flight to Phubai. I never heard of Phubai before. I had to go to a map and figure out where it was. It's slightly south of, south of Hue. To be assigned to the 101st Air Mobile. But once there, we were notified that our orders were canceled, and we returned to the 190th. Eventually, after breaking down bunkers and other positions around the base, we were sent to Long Binh. While there, we were assigned to the 716th MP Battalion. Most of my fellows were assigned to Companies A and B, located inside Saigon proper. The rest of us were assigned to Company C, located in Gia Dinh, near the MACV compound, commonly called Pentagon East. Each MP company was assigned to guard static posts, including CIA facilities, key U.S. installations inside the city, as well as providing checkpoints and general security within the greater Saigon area, including the Newport docks. Besides that, the 716th conducted motor and walking patrols. I remember driving my Jeep into Saigon and seeing a large concrete slab painted white with red letters reading, "The noble sacrifice of Allied soldiers will never be forgotten." It was located near the Arvin General Staff headquarters. During one motor patrol, I realized I was at the exact site where the first American who was killed in Vietnam in 1945, Peter Dewey. Shifts were rotated monthly, but the most difficult were days. The sun and the heat were unbearable, and anyone who's been in Vietnam can attest to that. If you were assigned to a static post, a Vietnamese national, often an elderly woman, would shortly open up a stand, almost like clockwork, selling sugar cane slices and Coke in plastic bags. Plastic bags. We were newbies. A more commonly used term for us were FNGs. Each company had a lifer, an NCO, who liked Vietnam and re-upped, just to serve there. I served with one, an incredible staff sergeant who I believe memorized the name of every deserter in country who was initially illicitly living in Saigon. I can't count the number of times he told me to follow that Lambretta, which is a three-wheeled vehicle that just had all this smoke and soot coming out of it all the time. Because a deserter was on board, even though I didn't see anyone on board that resembled a deserter. There were old-timers who stayed with the 716th long after their career in the Army was over. I always remember one in particular, a former NCO who lost both legs at the hip. He would get around on a small dolly, climbing stairs by elevating his arms with his hands. Since he always visited Charlie Company, I always thought he was critically wounded during the Tet Offensive in 1968. For most of the time, I was a traditional line duty MP. Then something happened in the middle of my tour that changed everything. One day, I was assigned to a checkpoint, monitoring incoming and outgoing vehicles and all personnel going in and out of this zone. One vehicle refused to stop and drove off. Nearby was a resting MP in a Jeep with his partner. And I told him to bring that vehicle back to me as quickly as possible. The occupant in the sedan was the U.S. Naval Attaché in Saigon. And they proceeded to berate me. How did I stop him and interfere with his pressing business? Since I was an enlisted man, I could not arrest an officer. I had to call for the order of the officer of the day. So I got on my radio, called the officer of the day, and he handled it from there. Upon my return to my billet, there was a note on my bed, and I thought the worst. One-man security patrol along the DMZ, something like that. But instead, I was reassigned to a detachment to protect the Comas MACV, Commander U.S. Military Forces, Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, and his deputy. As part of the detail called the Commander's Guard, I helped provide personal security at his residence and at Hotel 3, a helicopter base near Tan Son Nhut that maintained 2 UE helicopters assigned to Creighton Abrams and Frederick Wyant. Sometimes General Abrams would like to mess with me, checking my military bearing. Instead of walking directly to my post, he would walk through the garden, through his flowers, and come up behind me to see if I was attentive or not. By this time, Vietnamization was in full swing. American troop levels were drastically reduced. Then the North Vietnamese must have thought that the time was ready for another offensive operation and struck during the Easter offensive on March 30th, 1972. President Nixon ordered the mining of Haiphong Harbor and expanded bombing missions over North Vietnam. Some ARVN units collapsed, particularly at An Loc. Prior to the Easter offensive, Tan Son Nhut had been spared rocket attacks, but not now. I was there when rockets landed inside the wire at Hotel 3. All the civilian contractors disappeared, leaving me, the flight controller, and the post commander on duty. The security troops from Charlie Company, 197th Light Infantry, were totally combat ineffective. By this time, the U.S. Army in Vietnam was dissolving, with increased drug problems and maintenance of good order and discipline within the ranks became highly problematic. Most combat units were withdrawn, leaving advisors, service and support, and security personnel in country. When President Nixon was seeking peace with honor, it was in the early fall that I finally received my orders to go home. I received a drop. Anyone that was observant during that time, no matter what they believed about Vietnam, realized at that point it wasn't going to end well. But no one wanted to be the last casualty in Vietnam either, not in December of 1972 or January 1973. Once at a Saigon USO, a Vietnamese national told me that the American government would never abandon Vietnam. I told her honestly not to count on it. I told her once Americans leave, they will never return in a combat role to Vietnam. Upon my return to CONUS, I was assigned to the 506th MP Company at Aberdeen Proving Grounds to fulfill my military obligation. Then I received a 90-day early out to return to college. Matter of fact, upon my discharge, I drove straight from New Jersey to Emporia in slightly less than 24 hours. I parked my car on Mechanic Street and walked to my first class, even though I didn't have a place to stay at the time. Although my war in Vietnam was over, my life as a Vietnam veteran was about to begin. During the Vietnam War, nearly 9.1 million men served in the military in all branches. Those men and women fall within a category deemed by the Veterans Administration and the Pentagon as Vietnam-era veterans. But within that group is a subcategory for those who served in country, about 2.7 million men. They are, by all definition, Vietnam veterans, and they amount to roughly 9.7% of their generation who served their country, who risked their life and limb. Although the men and women who served in country returned home, they returned as individuals, not as units. There were no yellow ribbons around old oak trees or parades greeting them upon their return. All they could depend on was their loved ones waiting at airports, train stations, or bus stations. They never asked nor expected preferential treatment for their service, but only a shot at being all they could be. Thank you for your service and willingness to be here in Abilene on this important day.
Chris, we have time for some questions.
Any questions?
We'll take the microphone around.
Okay.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
I'd like to thank you for all the service and the activity in the military and in the Marine Corps that you have done through the years and protecting the country and protecting families and giving your 100% to the nation. And my question is, what great big percent of the African American people that joined the military or was drafted have an impact on the outcome of winning the Vietnam War?
about 25% of all minorities served in Vietnam. And basically they served in combat arms. In the early night, well, in the middle part of the war, the Army tried a program called Project 100,000, where they began recruiting and accepting people for induction that didn't meet the minimum standards to be in the Army. Most of those men were, the idea was that if you allowed them to join the Army, that they would basically find a home and find discipline and order and regimentation in their life. And it really didn't work out well. It was a major social engineering problem. And the author of that program was Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
I want to thank you and for the MPs that help support our gun shipments. Every time we went to Phu Bai, we were the 805th Transportation Battalion, called Gear Jammers. And if you hadn't been for the MPs, we would have got wiped out many times on the Ha Long Pass and going to all the different fire bases, Eagle, Evans, Phu Bai, and My Lai. We hauled ammunition supplies all over up Highway 1. And I want to thank you and the MPs for your support.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. My question is, Vietnam, was it ever 100% a war or conflict?
It was a war.
It was a war.
It was a war.
You mentioned while you were there, you heard stories of deserters that remained behind in Saigon. As a scholar and doing research, were you able to validate that there was a large population that remained? And is there any of that remains in Vietnam today?
The only remains today in Vietnam are basically people that their aircraft were shot down. The bodies were never recovered. The Vietnamese and the American research teams are basically doing their best to locate them. I served all told about 26 years in the military. Most of my years in the United States National Guard, the Kansas National Guard, as an intelligence officer. And when I was at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, going to a warrant officer advanced course, I had the opportunity to work with some warrant officers who served on these relocation teams, identification teams. Some of these deserters made it out of country. As a matter of fact, they were telling me that they were finding deserters that were basically living in Australia requesting Social Security payments. And I mean, it's amazing. But it was sort of a myth too about, and I don't want to get into that, but Richard Nixon later in the war, what he tried to do was drum support for the conflict by saying we can't end the war until all the men have been accounted for. And I have one at home, many of you probably do too, POW bracelets. How many guys have POW bracelets? That was Plato. No one knows what, it was an accounting number. There's all sorts of novels and films depicting men that were left behind. And it's really an attack upon the U.S. government too. Now I'm saying this as a veteran and as a historian, that it was a way to get at the government. It's sort of the anti-government feeling that your government let you down and left men behind, willingly with malice aforethought. And I found that not to be true.
I was lieutenant in Vietnam. I want to ask you a question. Did you ever know Jim Harder at Emporia State?
Yes, I knew Jim.
Okay.
Not well, but I knew he was.
Okay, I was in training with him throughout the basic and AIT, and he didn't go on to OCS like I did, but I met him over at Fire Support Base in Vietnam, so he was a great guy and proud to serve with him. As I said, I was a lieutenant. I was sent to Vietnam. I ended up in Quang Ngai Province, Minh Long District, which is the poorest, least populated district in all of Vietnam. I was attached to the Special Forces, but my chain of command came through MACV.
Yeah.
To make a political statement I have indirect ties to the My Lai massacre. My Lai was in Quang Ngai province. I flew over it many times. And my interpreter was from the village next to My Lai, Lei Thi Ri. And when the My Lai massacre came about, I was in Vietnam. I was in Minh Long there. And I apologized to my interpreter, Mr. Ri. I said, I'm sorry for what happened. It's the only time that my interpreter ever was angry at me. He said, never apologize for what happened. I'm from the village next door to My Lai. And I can tell you that they came into my village, buried my people alive. They chopped off my friends' heads. They are evil people. And his last words were, let them all die. Now, I was go to Quang Ngai City, and I would go to Kramer Compound, and I would sit next to people from England, from Germany, Der Spiegel, Look, Life. They were there for one reason, and one reason only, and that was to convict Lieutenant Calley of crimes. And from my interpreter's position, there was no crime committed. It was part of war. And that was the biggest railroad job that I think that was ever committed in Vietnam. Now, I saw casualties from the people, the women in that village that would make grenades and wire trapping that you'd run into, and booby traps. The worst casualties I ever saw were from those people that would make those booby traps. And I want to say that if you ever go to war, you have to go to war. And things happen in war that you probably don't want to talk about, but they do happen. And I feel sorry for Lieutenant Calley. I feel sorry for Captain Medina. They got caught up in a situation that they probably didn't want to be caught up in. But that's my political statement.
There was a CIA analyst named Sam Adams. I don't know if you've ever heard of Sam Adams. Sam Adams basically was involved in numbers crunching, so to speak. And what he did was he looked at the NVA, NLF order of battle. And if you made a hand grenade, worked in a booby trap, regardless of age or sex or gender, he listed you as basically as an enemy combatant. Later on, CBS did a report in 1983. It appeared on CBS Evening News. Well, it was CBS Reports, sort of like a mini 60 Minutes, a whole episode for about an hour and 30 minutes, called The Uncounted Enemy. And they claim that William Westmoreland lied about the actual number of enemy forces in Vietnam they were confronting. He was working upon numbers based upon what MACV had. And he classified, for instance, an enemy combatant as male, a soldier, military age. And his numbers were much lower than basically what Sam Adams predicted and estimated. In many respects, Sam Adams was correct. In many locations, if you were combat infantry, you would go in one way on a patrol, and he made sure you came out in another way. You never left that combat area the same way you went in. But occasionally, you would meet what is called a moving booby trap, a moving ambush, because they would locate where you went, and they put down these booby traps, and then once they figured out the way you were leaving the combat area, they would try to relocate those booby traps. So in some respects, when Calley made that argument, and Medina did, that these people were combatants, it was a point that Adams himself probably would have agreed to. Westmoreland could never agree to that, nor could Creighton Abrams or any other one, because basically you're dealing with traditional non-combatants, whether then they were strap hangers or not. And not only were they shot and killed, they were raped and mutilated beyond what is called operational good order. And if anyone's to blame for that, It's basically the training and acceptance of Lieutenant Calley as an officer in the first place. And in our generation, my generation, is at fault. Because the men, the best and the brightest of our generation, who were natural born leaders, never really went, never joined ROTC. You have to remember that time. I mean, you didn't dare walk around with a uniform on. I remember flying in when I was dear roast home in LaGuardia Airport with my duffel bag on my shoulder, and someone knocked my duffel bag off my shoulder. Being a veteran, being a soldier in uniform, and $1.50 may get you a 16-ounce bottle of Diet Coke. But basically, we were not well received. Now, many veterans talked about this thing about being spat on, and that's more of a metaphor for rejection. And it took years before the American public accepted exactly what happened. I was shocked that later on during the first Gulf War, and I was in the National Guard, and I would stop at various localities when I was interviewing units about to be mobilized for the operation. People want to come up and hug me. And I kept saying to myself, you're just about 10 years too late. It just didn't happen.
I'll make a comment on that. I walked through the San Francisco airport with my jungle fatigues and two crossbows across my shoulder, and no one touched me.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, they respected me.
I was in the U.S. Navy, so I wasn't really in combat, although they did shoot at us all the time because they were trying to eliminate us for what we were doing. But anyway, my comment is, I always thought one of the stupidest things that I ever heard in my life while I was over there is that all the units that were out in the bush or wherever they were having a body count. Yeah. Now, what kind of dumbass thing is that? Having a body count? Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
And I always felt really bad and really sorry for Lieutenant Calley for what we did to him and stuff, because if you want a body count, I'll give you a body count. I mean, because sometimes you didn't run into anybody, but when you got back, you had to have a body count.
It led to a great deal of corruption.
Yeah, exactly right.
Great deal of corruption. It was the only way that they measured a victory, basically, of how they, we didn't liberate villages and hold territory. It was how many men that you killed. And it was sheer estimate. We found a leg, maybe 2 legs, 3 legs. That meant maybe there were 2 or 3 people, or maybe 6 people. They were totally corrupted. Anyone that knows anything about the body count system, it was idiotic, completely idiotic. It demonstrated a failure of thought and strategic planning.
Yes, absolutely.
I understand that Vietnam was a third world nation, a third world country, and that they didn't have much funds to purchase weapons and arms. So where did they get their
From the Soviet Union.
Soviet?
Yeah, not from Red China. See, most Americans, and this is a real tragedy, we'll probably talk about it when we're up in the panel, is that intelligence failed us. The Red Scare in the 1950s failed us too. We didn't have anyone that knew anything about Southeast Asia, or at least a well-awareness of the antipathy that existed between the Vietnamese and the Chinese. Most of all combat support for the North Vietnamese basically came from the Soviet Union. Matter of fact, there were accounts, and this was a fear. If you were in a combat unit and you were in the northern, say, I Corps, and you were in combat against an NVA regiment of sort, there were reports that they saw a Caucasian with those NVA troops. And the big fear, the major fear on the part of the American side, particularly MACV, was that you had a deserter, an American, defecting to the NVA. High probability they were Russian advisors. Only after the fall of the Soviet Union does that become known. And much like also that the Soviets were flying MiGs for the Red Chinese during the Korean War too. That people didn't, the government really didn't tell people about that either.
I'd just like to make a comment on my return from Vietnam. I served at Long Binh, Benoit. I was there during TAT at Long Binh. So in, I think it was July of, or 1st of August of 68, I returned to Oakland for reassignment. I went to Travis, we came into Travis, but leaving San Francisco was about, I think my flight was 2:30 in the morning. I went military standby. And I figured when I went over to Vietnam, I left Wichita, but I had to be in Fort Lewis at 12 noon on Sunday, and I left 4:30 Sunday morning. So I knew I had to make that or I was desertion. So I went military standby, and there was 5 of us flying a plane to Fort Lewis, which is all that was on that plane. So flying standby, I come back, and there were students also flying standby. And they started loading the plane. They loaded, they started calling off students. There was another veteran and I sitting there that had registered after we had, and they were loading them, but they weren't loading us. Well, I got a little letter ticket. I went up and asked the attendant. She said, "Don't worry, you're going to get on the flight." 5 minutes before the gate was to close, they boarded us in first class. I wish I could remember the name of that flight.
Yeah, I remember when I was waiting for my flight. I was leaving Oakland, basically leaving Travis Air Force Base and going to San Francisco to catch a flight to Kansas City. And the airline stewardess was very nice to me. Came up and talked to me, wondered what I was doing. When I landed in LaGuardia, eventually I stopped in Kansas City to see my girlfriend, and then basically flew to see my parents in New Jersey. And it was another matter when I got to LaGuardia.
I'm not a Vietnam vet, but I do appreciate all you fellows that served. It's deeply appreciated. During the middle 60s, there was a real popular book by Robin Moore,
Green Beret.
Green Beret, which I read in the late 60s, a year or two after it was published, and truthfully, it was helped me understand a lot of things about Vietnam, in particular, that I did not know. My question for you is, you're probably familiar with that book, and my question is, was that a good representation, at least in small part, of the situation in Vietnam in the late 60s?
Basically, it was covering a period during the advisory period in Vietnam when the Army relied upon special forces, because Kennedy had a fantasy and a fixation for special operations. And basically that's what that book depicts. As a matter of fact, Kennedy allowed the special forces to begin wearing a beret. During the Eisenhower administration, that was forbidden. And it was a way of winning a different sort of war. Nikita Khrushchev came up with this idea of wars of national liberation, and this was Kennedy's response to that by using special forces operations. And special force operators, as we call them today. We're doing the same thing in Syria as well.
Was it an accurate description?
Yeah, it's fairly accurate. Matter of fact, when they made the movie, John Wayne created a special forces outpost,
From having had a lifetime to reflect on this, do you have a take-home message, something that we can apply today that we learned in Vietnam?
Basically, if I try to tell my students, when we cover the Vietnam War, you have to be an engaged public. You have to know exactly what's going on. Vietnam's happened when people don't know what's actually occurring. During the second Gulf War, we had teach-ins like you did during the Vietnam War. And most of our students were really gung-ho as long as they didn't have to go. See, and that's the big difference. That was a learning tool for the U.S. Army, because they realized, and Senator Richard Nixon realized, that basically what was driving the interwar opposition was the high draft calls, the body counts, American casualties, and stuff like that. Once the draft ended, as we know it, and you began to go to an all-volunteer army, and you begin to rely upon volunteer serving, you have an American public that's been totally disengaged from what's actually going on in the world. I mean, how many National Guardsmen have made tours and reservists made tours to places like Afghanistan, Somalia, every hotspot? How many? How many? Think about that. Way too many. And you have a population that knows nothing about war. You know, their view is let someone else do it. It's our civic responsibility to serve your country, whether it's basically serving on a jury or serving in the military. Even though I hated being a draftee, it was the only fair and equitable thing to do. You know, defending your country is a civic obligation. And I think by ending the draft, you rely upon too few men and too few women doing too many things for everyone else.
I think they should have, I think that President Bush should have started the draft right after 9/11.
Oh, I agree.
Yeah.
Good morning, Vietnam! Remember that? Anyway, I was one of those guys that was sent down there in '65, landed up there in Ancape. Anybody been to Ancape? Up in the Highlands? Great, great. I should see you guys later on. Anyway, let's not forget those guys that never came back. You know, my gosh, there were so many good friends that never had a chance to come back. I was lucky. I came back in '66, and I was stationed in Fort Dix. And everybody at the airport in Frisco, he was so happy to see us. Later on, this thing really changed. And it really hurts me a lot. And in a way, when I go down to Walmart, I see young kids coming up and tell me, thank you for your service. That is a wonderful, wonderful feeling that you get when people tell you these things. Vietnam has a lot of good and bad memories for a whole lot of us. I, unfortunately, had a lot of bad memories after Vietnam because Agent Orange got a hold of me. Maybe a lot of you guys are in the same place. And about 4 or 5 years ago, I had prostate cancer to that result. I don't feel all that bitter. I did my job. And I was proud to serve in Vietnam with a lot of guys, a company of heroes that we call them. I'm so glad to see all you guys out here today. And every time I get together with all the guys that served in Vietnam, it fills my heart with pride. Thank you so much for making it today. And welcome back, brothers. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a Black Horse over Vietnam. We landed in Cambodia, and I got out of Cambodia. We wasn't supposed to be over there, but we never got no medal. We got to provide the war over there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You know, were you there prior to 1970 or?
Yeah, 69, 70.
Yeah, so, you know, so basically, you know, there was a need to expand the war. At least this became part and parcel of the problem. You know, you had, and this was a problem we faced in Vietnam. You had active sanctuaries where the enemy could basically go. Cambodia was one. We were already engaged in Laos. And once you expand the war into Laos and into Cambodia, particularly Cambodia, you know, where did the enemy go? They just went deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper into the country. And basically you had Pol Pot, the Khmer Rouge, where the Americans had no intent basically of solving that issue at all. And if you know anything about the killing fields or ever watched the movie The Killing Fields, it's worthwhile to take a look at. And that was the consequence of expanding the war into Cambodia.
But on this body count, we say like there was 20 people dead,
Yeah.
but the Americans, they raised up to 30.
Yeah, that's what they would do. They would up it, you know, to make the commander look better. You know, you've really reached your objective and your quota. Thank you very much.